I'm Clara Monroe, 22, and by last Thanksgiving, I had learned to stretch a dollar until it thinned like paper. I walked campus in sneakers patched with tape and told myself it was only temporary that grit would close the gap. The Whitaker mansion glowed at the end of a long, curving drive, every window lit, like a promise I couldn't afford to keep, and I felt that old tug between pride and the uneasy quiet I carried home at night. I remember the scent of cinnamon and roasted turkey as I stepped inside the chandelier light, catching the edges of crystal, the soft hum of people who never had to count change for bus fare. My parents laughed too loudly in the parlor. My grandmother floated from room to room with perfect timing, and my grandfather was already seated at the head of the table, as if the chair had been built for him. I took my place, folded my napkin, and tried to be smaller than the question that had lived in me for years. The room's settled silver clinked against porcelain, and a hush gathered like breath before a storm. When my grandfather stood to speak, his eyes found mine and held, and something inside me rose to meet them. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground at a family table, tap like and subscribe so more of us can find each other. I grew up in a small rental on the west side of town, where summer heat pressed through thin walls and winter drafts climbed in around the windows, the kind of place where you learn to make soup from what you have and share it without keeping score. My mother believed a clean floor meant a clear mind. My father believed in keeping things to himself, and I learned early that kindness didn't need an audience. When I was 12, my grandmother taught me how to iron a blouse and walk into a room as if I belonged there. When I was 16, I got my first job refilling coffee at a diner with a ripped vinyl booth, and I liked how work steadied my hands. By college, a campus cafe paid what it could, and I studied between latte orders, eyes aching by midnight, telling myself that endurance had its own quiet shine. The gulf between my days and the world at my grandfather's estate felt like stepping from a gravel road onto a velvet rug. Everything at the mansion moved without friction. Doors opened, coats disappeared, names were remembered, glasses refilled before you could ask. I would stand in the foyer and smooth the same dress I wore to every formal dinner. Hearing my mother say I looked fine, hearing my own voice agree, because it was easier than naming the pinch at the ribs where worry sits. That night, the table could have held a small orchestra linen starched to a perfect edge, candles steady, place cards written in a hand I recognized from my grandmother's letters. My Aunt Paula watched everything with a polite smile that sharpened at the corners. My Uncle Stephen folded his napkin into patient squares, and little Caleb built a hill out of mashed potatoes with the seriousness only children possess. My father told a story about traffic on the interstate as if it were a stranger we could all laugh about. My mother nodded along, catching reflections in the silver and checking them for flaws. I kept my hands in my lap and measured my breaths, thinking about the rent due in 2 weeks, the textbooks I had bought secondhand, the shoes I'd patched for the third time because I'd chosen groceries instead. Gratitude is a good habit, and sometimes a heavy one. I carried it anyway, the way you learn to carry a bag that digs into your shoulder and try not to leave marks. I thought about my grandmother's voice on the phone the week before, warm as a quilt, telling me she couldn't wait to see me. I thought about how, in our family, silence had often done the work of explanation, and how I had learned to fit myself around it. My grandfather cleared his throat, and conversation fell away in a soft ring, like the last note of a song. He didn't talk much at these dinners, not unless the occasion mattered, and even then he kept it short, which made people lean in to catch each word. He raised his glass, and his hands did not shake. The man who built factories and hired towns knew how to stand in a room and give it a reason to listen. He spoke about seasons turning and the way a family holds steady, when the wind shifts about children becoming the kind of people you can be proud to stand beside. The candles moved in the fine draft of an old house, making small halos on the crystal, and somewhere down the table my brother tapped at his phone until my mother touched his wrist and he set it aside. I watched my grandfather's face and tried to read what came next, the way you read weather on a horizon when you've lived long enough to respect a sky. The line that would split the evening from everything that came before was already gathering in his chest, a simple sentence with a hinge in the middle, and I felt it without knowing the words. My fork held still above the stuffing, my napkin warmed under my palm, and it occurred to me that you can live years inside a question and not recognize its outline until someone says it out loud. My grandmother glanced from him to me as if she could hear the turn as well, her expression careful, her hand finding the stem of her glass as though touch could anchor sound. I remember the color of the room gold over cream, a thread of red from the candlelight more clearly than I remember the taste of anything served that night. And I remember understanding in a way that had weight that a truth can sit in plain sight and still arrive like a door opening you didn't know was there. My grandfather lifted his glass a fraction higher, his gaze steady and kind, and when he spoke again, everyone at the table leaned forward as if the table itself had moved. When my grandfather's words reached the end of that sentence, time seemed to pause. "And Clara," he said, his voice full of warmth, "I'm glad to see you're putting the college fund we set up to good use." For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. My fork froze midair. The light from the chandelier caught on the rim of my glass, scattering into tiny sparks that seemed too bright for what I was hearing. College fund. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, rippling through every corner of the table. Across from me, my father coughed into his napkin, his face flushed a deep, uneasy red. My mother's smile fell away, her knuckles whitening around her fork. Aunt Paula's eyebrows arched with that familiar, dangerous curiosity, while my cousins suddenly found the gravy boat fascinating. Even little Caleb looked up from his mashed potato sculpture confused. "Wait," he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "You didn't know." The question hung in the air. My throat tightened as I turned toward my parents. "What fund?" I asked quietly. My father's eyes darted to his plate. My mother's lips parted, then pressed together again, as if she could hold the truth behind them. Grandpa's smile faded into confusion. "The college fund we started when you were born," he said. "Haven't you been using it for tuition? We've added to it every year, birthdays, Christmas. It should have covered almost everything." My breath caught. I shook my head. No one ever told me I managed. I didn't know it existed. A murmur rippled around the table. My grandmother's hand fluttered to her chest. Aunt Paula leaned forward, her tone sharp. "Then who's been managing it?" she asked. My father cleared his throat. "We didn't think she needed to know," he said, still staring at his plate. I felt something in me shift like a rope finally snapping after years of strain. "Didn't need to know," I repeated. My voice came out thinner than I meant it to, trembling. My mother jumped in her tone, brittle and fast. "We used it for the house for Bill's emergencies. We thought it was best." Grandpa's expression changed in an instant. His jaw tightened. His hand lowered his glass with a deliberate calm that carried more weight than anger. "What do you mean you used it?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like glass. I could hear my heartbeat. I pushed back my chair, the legs scraping the floor. "You didn't think I needed to know," I said louder this time. My father still refused to look at me. "You were doing fine," he said, his tone defensive. "You always have. You've managed." I laughed once, a sound sharp enough to hurt. "Fine. I'm working 20 hours a week on top of full-time classes. I eat noodles for dinner because I can't afford groceries. I patch my shoes with tape because I don't have the money for new ones. That's your version of fine." My mother's eyes filled, but her voice hardened. "We had no choice. The roof was leaking. The car broke down. Your brother needed braces. We did what we had to do for the family. For the family." My words came out colder than I expected. "Wasn't I part of that? Clara," she snapped, her voice rising. "You were a child. You wouldn't have understood how bad things were." I felt something inside me break open. "I was a child when you decided to steal my future," I said quietly. "But I'm not a child now, and I understand perfectly." Silence spread across the room like fog. No one spoke. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, my cousins, my aunt, my grandmother, with tears trembling in her eyes. Finally, my grandfather spoke. His tone was steady, but it carried the weight of decades. "That money was never meant for you two," he said, looking straight at my parents. "It was Clara's. We made that very clear when we created the fund." My father's jaw clenched. "Maybe if you hadn't insisted on putting it in our names, this wouldn't have happened," he muttered. Grandpa's voice dropped lower. "We put it in your names because we trusted you." He paused, each word deliberate. Clearly that trust was misplaced. My mother's hand trembled against her plate. I looked from one to the other, my voice shaking. How much was in it? My grandfather hesitated. Around 40,000 by the time you turned 18, he said softly. Probably more, we kept adding. 40,000. The number rang in my head. Enough to pay off every loan, every unpaid bill, every sleepless night I'd spent wondering if I could afford another semester. My knees felt weak. You let me drown in debt. I said, my voice low but clear. You watched me scrape and struggle while you sat on what could have changed everything. My father stared at his empty plate. We did what we had to do, he said again, the same phrase, smaller now. No, I said. You did what was convenient. My mother reached across the table, tears spilling over. We only wanted to protect the family, she said. I pulled my hand away. Don't call it protection. Call it what it is, betrayal. For a long moment, no one moved. The chandelier buzzed faintly above us. I looked around that glittering room at the people who had always told me to be grateful to work hard to keep my head down. My legs shook, but I forced myself to stay standing. I wasn't the quiet daughter anymore. When I sat back down, my grandmother spoke, her voice trembling. We need to talk about this, all of us. But the words felt distant, like they were coming from underwater. I stared at my hands, remembering every late shift, every blister, every night I'd fallen asleep on borrowed textbooks. I had thought endurance was a kind of love. Now it felt like evidence. You let me believe we were broke, I said softly. You let me think I had to do it all on my own. My mother cried harder. Clara, please don't. You don't get to ask me for grace, I said, my voice breaking but firm. Not after this. My grandfather sat perfectly still. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was disappointment so deep it made my chest ache to see it. Aunt Paula whispered something under her breath, but I couldn't hear it over the sound of my own pulse. I reached for my phone without thinking. Months of records lived there, screenshots, receipts, pay stubs, the scholarship letters I'd kept, like proof that effort mattered. My father noticed the glow of the screen, and for the first time all night fear flickered across his face. He knew what it meant. I stood up, slipped my phone into my bag, and grabbed my coat. My grandmother's voice followed me as I turned toward the door. Clara, where are you going? I didn't answer. My throat was too tight. I walked through the hall lined with portraits, faces that smiled down from another century, men who built fortunes, and women who kept their composure. Their gaze followed me past the velvet drapes, past the smell of cinnamon and turkey, out into the cold night where the air felt mercifully real. By the time I reached my car, tears blurred the world into streaks of gold and shadow. I sat behind the wheel, shaking, but my hands didn't let go. The house glowed behind me like a monument to everything I no longer believed in. The drive back to campus was quiet. My headlights stretched over the empty road, cutting through fog that thickened near the bridge. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The silence pressed against me until it hardened into something else, resolve. When I reached my apartment, I left the lights off. The air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and detergent, the ordinary scent of my life. I sat down at my desk, turned on the old lamp, and pulled out a scrap of paper with a number written in my grandfather's neat handwriting, the bank he'd mentioned once years ago. My hands were steady as I dialed. My name is Clara Monroe, I said when someone answered. I believe I'm the beneficiary of a college trust fund that's been mismanaged. The woman on the other end sounded puzzled. If you're the beneficiary, how could you not have known? I exhaled slowly. Because my parents never told me. It took hours, holds, verifications, transfers from one department to another, but by the end I had confirmation. The fund had been emptied, not all at once but in small, methodical withdrawals over 7 years, every one authorized by my parents. The woman hesitated before she spoke again. You may want to consult an attorney, she said carefully. If the trust was restricted to your education, this could be considered misappropriation. Misappropriation. The word echoed in my head, heavy and foreign. My parents' people who taught me to tell the truth, who kissed my forehead goodnight, might have committed a crime. When I hung up, the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat there for a long time staring at the phone, my reflection faint in the dark window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow, steady flakes catching the streetlight. I thought of my grandfather's face when the truth surfaced, the disappointment in his eyes. I gathered my papers, the scholarships, the loan statements, the emails I had saved without knowing why, and stacked them neatly on the table. Each one was a piece of proof that I had carried more than my share. Each one was a small light in the dark. I zipped them into a folder and placed it beside my bag. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. I wasn't that quiet girl anymore. Tomorrow I'd take the folder to someone who could help me. I didn't know where it would lead, only that I couldn't go back. The trust might be gone, but I had something left, evidence, and the will to use it. The next morning, the air in my apartment felt different, still heavy, like the quiet before a storm you already know will find you. I set my folder on the table beside the cold coffee I hadn't finished and looked at the list I'd written the night before legal aid, bank representative, copies of documents. It felt like armor made of paper. I had lived years believing silence kept the peace, but silence had only protected the wrong people. At the campus legal aid office, a woman named Karen Doyle greeted me. She looked to be in her 50s, her voice calm, her hands steady, as she motioned for me to sit. "Tell me what's going on," she said. I slid the folder across her desk, my fingers trembling as I unzipped it. Inside were pages of proof emails, statements, the trust summary my grandfather had sent, and the bank confirmation from last night. She read in silence, eyes narrowing as she turned each page. When she looked up, her tone softened, but carried weight. "Clara, based on what you've brought, this isn't just a family misunderstanding. This could qualify as misappropriation. If the trust was legally bound for your education, they violated the terms." Her words hit harder than I expected. "That means it's a crime?" I asked quietly. She nodded once. "Potentially, but whether you want to press charges or pursue restitution is your choice." I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the folder between us, the same one I'd filled piece by piece over the years, without knowing what it would come to. It was strange to think that the habit of keeping receipts and records, something I'd done out of survival, might now hold the key to something bigger. She gave me a list of next steps: file a written complaint with the bank, document every communication, and prepare for the possibility of a formal investigation. "You don't need to decide today," she added gently. "Just know that you have the right to." I thanked her, folded the papers back into my bag, and stepped outside into the cold. The winter sun felt thin, barely warming my hands, but it was enough to steady me. That evening, as the wind rattled the windows, there was a knock at my door. Sharp, familiar, insistent. I froze halfway to the kitchen, the sound hitting me like an echo from another life. When I opened the door, my father stood there, shoulders hunched, eyes dark with exhaustion. His coat collar was turned up against the cold, and he looked smaller somehow, like the man who had once carried me on his shoulders had been replaced by a shadow. "Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was quiet but strained. I hesitated, the words from last night still echoing between us, then stepped aside. He walked in slowly, looking around as if seeing my apartment for the first time, the cracked paint, the sagging couch, the second-hand bookshelf stuffed with worn textbooks. "You really live like this," he murmured. "This is what managing looks like," I said. My tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. He rubbed his forehead, sinking onto the couch. "I came to explain," he said. "We never meant for it to go this far. Your mother and I thought we'd pay it back before you needed it." I crossed my arms. "You had 18 years to tell me. You chose not to." He nodded, eyes downcast. "At first it was just a small withdrawal, repairs, bills, your brother's school trip. Then we fell behind. We kept meaning to replace it, but one thing led to another. It spiraled." "Spiraled," I said quietly. "Every withdrawal had your signature. You had choices." He winced. "You don't understand. Ryan's surgery, he needed it. He's always been the one who needed more," I interrupted. "And because I managed, you decided I needed less." He didn't answer. The silence said enough. I could see guilt sitting on him like weight he couldn't put down, but the damage had already been done. "You were supposed to protect me," I said finally. "Instead, you took what was mine." His shoulders slumped. "We're sorry, Clara. Truly." "We thought I don't want an apology," I said. "I want honesty. I want accountability." He stood, his voice breaking. "You're really going to turn on your own family over money?" I shook my head. "This isn't about money. It's about trust. You broke it." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then quietly, I opened the door. "You should go." He hesitated, searching my face for something that wasn't there anymore. Finally, he stepped past me and into the hall. "We love you," he said softly. "Then you should have acted like it," I replied, closing the door behind him. The quiet afterward was thick enough to touch. I stood there listening to his footsteps fade until the sound disappeared completely. My hands shook as I turned off the lamp and sat at the kitchen table. I thought about the years I'd spent convincing myself that endurance was love, that doing without was what good daughters did. But sitting there in that silence, I realized endurance had kept me small. The next afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from my grandfather, "Meet me tomorrow. Just us." When I walked into the small diner near campus the next day, he was already there, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. He looked older than I remembered, his eyes tired, but his voice steady. "I'm sorry, Clara," he said, before I even sat down. "You don't have to be," I replied. "You didn't do anything." He shook his head. "I trusted the wrong people. That's on me." He slid an envelope across the table. "I checked with the bank. The fund is gone. Every cent. They confirmed the withdrawals." I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. "What now?" "You have options," he said. "Legal ones. The bank will cooperate if you choose to pursue it. And you should. But this," he tapped the envelope gently, "is yours. It's not much, but it's a start. I also want you to know I've changed my will. Everything I leave will go into a trust only for you. No one else can touch it." My throat tightened. "You don't have to do that." "I do," he said simply. "You've carried too much alone." When I got home that night, I opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $20,000. My eyes blurred, not from relief, but from the weight of it. My grandfather believed I was worth protecting. My parents never had. The holidays arrived 2 weeks later. My grandparents invited the family for Christmas dinner, a tradition older than me. The mansion was dressed in garlands and gold lights, the air thick with cinnamon and pine. To anyone passing by, it would have looked picture perfect. But for me, stepping through those doors felt like walking into a test I hadn't studied for. My parents were there, trying to act as if nothing had changed. My mother laughed too loudly with Aunt Paula in the kitchen. My father lingered by the fireplace with a drink in hand, his eyes flicking toward me every few seconds. I took my seat beside my grandmother, who squeezed my hand under the table. Across from us, my brother scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the tension. Dinner began in strained politeness. Conversation drifted from weather to football, no one daring to touch the subject that hung between us. When my father rose for his usual toast, his smile looked practiced. "We're proud of how far our family has come," he said, raising his glass. "Even in tough times, we've always stuck together." The words rang hollow. My chair scraped the floor as I stood. Every face turned toward me. "Stuck together," I said quietly. "Is that what we're calling it?" My father's smile faltered. "Clara, this isn't the time." I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick folder I'd brought. The sound of it hitting the table echoed in the silence. "This is the full breakdown of the college trust," I said evenly. "Every withdrawal, every signature, cross-referenced with my student loans and scholarships, in case anyone still thinks I'm overreacting." Gasps rippled around the room. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Please," she whispered, "not tonight." "How many nights did I walk home in the rain because I couldn't afford bus fare?" I asked. "How many times did I skip meals so I could make tuition on time while you spent what was meant for me?" My father slammed his glass down. "We did what we had to do." "It was for the family." I met his eyes. "For the family. Then why was I the only one left behind?" No one spoke. The chandelier lights trembled slightly above us, and for once no one looked away. My hands were steady as I closed the folder. "I filed a complaint with the bank. Legal proceedings are in motion. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because actions have consequences. My mother's tears streaked her face. My father stared down at his glass. My grandmother's eyes were wet but proud. My grandfather rose slowly and came to stand beside me, resting a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. I knotted my throat tight. I picked up my coat and the folder, the sound of it closing as final as a door shutting. "Merry Christmas," I said softly. Then I walked out into the snow. Outside, the air bit at my cheeks, the sky pale with reflected light. I didn't look back at the mansion glowing behind me. Somewhere inside, voices had started to rise, but I was already walking toward my car. The snow crunched beneath my boots, each step quieter than the last. By the time I reached the gate, the night had gone still again. I pulled the scarf tighter around my neck and whispered to myself, not in anger, but in certainty, "It's my turn now." Snow still covered the streets the next morning, piled high against the curbs and softening the noise of the world outside my window. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the radiator, its steady rhythm the only thing that felt certain. On the table beside me sat the folder, my proof, my protection, my burden. I hadn't slept much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the look on my parents' faces. When I left the mansion, my father's clenched jaw, my mother's shaking hands. But underneath the exhaustion was something new: clarity. The letter from the bank arrived 2 days later, stamped with the Whitaker name in formal black ink. The words were careful official, but the meaning was simple. The investigation had begun. If evidence confirmed fraud, restitution would be required, or further legal action would follow. I read it 3 times before setting it down. There was no joy in it, no triumph, just a quiet recognition that things were finally moving. I folded the letter into the folder and placed it back on the table, like a piece of glass I couldn't afford to drop. I didn't tell anyone right away, not even my grandfather. I needed time to understand what it meant for me, what it might mean for them. I still went to class, still poured coffee for students who talked about vacations and new cars, still smiled when customers told me I looked tired. It was easier than explaining the truth that my life had cracked open, and I was trying to rebuild it piece by piece. A week later, my grandfather called. "Come by the house," he said. "We need to talk." His voice sounded calmer than it had at Christmas, but there was something heavy beneath it. I agreed, though every part of me resisted the thought of walking through those doors again. When I arrived, the house was quieter than I'd ever known it. The staff moved quietly, avoiding eye contact. My grandmother met me at the door and pulled me into a gentle embrace. "He's in the study," she said softly. "He's proud of you, Clara. Don't forget that." My grandfather was sitting by the fire papers spread across the table beside him. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable. "I've spoken with the lawyers," he said. "The bank confirmed your report. They'll proceed with formal restitution. But I wanted to see you myself before anything else moves forward." I sat across from him, my hands clasped in my lap. "I didn't want it to come to this," I said quietly. "I know," he replied. "But sometimes justice looks like paperwork instead of peace." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "Your grandmother and I agreed you should have this." Inside was a simple gold bracelet with a single charm, a small compass. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She always said a compass doesn't point to comfort. It points to true north." I fastened it around my wrist, the metal cool against my skin. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You've done the right thing, Clara. No one should carry someone else's wrongdoing in silence. But I also need you to know that whatever happens next, you still have a family here." When I left the study, my grandmother walked me to the door, her eyes shining. "It's not your fault," she whispered. "Sometimes truth is the only way to start again." Back at the apartment, I set the bracelet beside my laptop and opened the latest email from the bank's investigator, James Harlan. He'd requested additional documentation copies of tax statements, old account ledgers, and any direct correspondence between my parents and the trust. I spent the next 3 evenings compiling everything. My small kitchen table disappeared beneath piles of paper. Every page carried a memory, a birthday, a holiday, the years when I thought my family's struggles were shared. When I finished scanning the last document, I sat back and looked at the growing stack. The evidence told a story I didn't want, but couldn't ignore. My parents hadn't just taken money, they had taken my trust piece by piece until nothing was left. I sealed the envelope for Mr. Harlan and dropped it at the post office the next morning. Later that afternoon, as I returned from class, I saw my father's car parked by the curb outside my building. He stepped out as soon as he saw me. The last of the snow was melting on the street, and the cold air made his breath visible. "Clara," he began, his voice low, "we got the letter." I didn't speak. He rubbed his hands together, looking down. "We could lose the house," he said. "They're freezing the accounts until this is resolved. Do you understand what that means for us?" "For you," I said quietly. "Not for me." He shook his head. "It's all gone too far. Your mother hasn't stopped crying. This isn't what family does. Family doesn't steal," I replied. "They don't watch someone struggle and say nothing." He stepped closer, his expression tightening. "You're really going to destroy your parents over money." "It's not about money," I said, my voice steady. "It's about truth. You taught me to be honest. Now I am." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned toward the car. "You'll regret this one day," he muttered, before driving away. That night, I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker against the melting snow. Regret was the last thing I felt. What I felt was tired but free, in a way I hadn't been before. The next morning, I forwarded the encounter to Mr. Harlan as part of my statement. He replied within the hour noted. "We'll proceed with the next phase." Weeks passed slowly after that. Spring crept in with pale sunlight and muddy sidewalks. I focused on finishing my final semester. Between classes and work, I checked in with the investigators only when necessary. Each update came with the same assurance the case was moving forward and my parents would be required to repay the full amount. There was even talk of additional penalties, though I asked them not to pursue anything criminal. I didn't want a courtroom, I just wanted closure. When graduation day arrived, I stood on the stage in my cap and gown scanning the crowd. My grandfather sat in the front row beside my grandmother, both smiling proudly. There were 2 empty seats beside them, reserved but untouched. My father's name was printed on the program, but he never came. I told myself that was fine. Some absences speak louder than presence ever could. After the ceremony, my grandfather hugged me tightly. "You did it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And you did it on your own." "I didn't, Grandpa," I said. "You helped me remember who I was." He smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "Maybe. But you were always her." A week later, I received the final notice from the bank restitution, confirmed funds repaid in full by my parents. The account balance showed 0 debt on my record. I stared at the screen for a long time before closing it. The number didn't feel like victory. It felt like quiet justice, like a door finally closing. I used part of my savings to pay down my remaining student loans and moved into a small but bright apartment closer to my new job. I bought furniture that wasn't secondhand and a single pair of new shoes, the kind that didn't need tape to hold together. The rest of the money I set aside in a savings account under my name alone. Life didn't change overnight. Some nights I still woke with the old ache of worry, expecting another call, another letter, another apology that never came. But as weeks turned to months, that ache softened into something else understanding. I couldn't rewrite what my parents had done, but I could decide what came next. One evening, as I unpacked the last box in my new apartment, I found the velvet pouch my grandfather had given me. I slipped the bracelet onto my wrist and traced the small compass charm with my thumb. It caught the light from the window and reflected it back like a quiet promise. For the first time, I realized what true north felt like. Not comfort, not perfection, but direction. When I looked at my reflection in the glass, I didn't see the girl who had once kept her head down at that long family table. I saw a woman who had faced what others hid, who had learned that truth carries its own kind of grace. And though I didn't know if forgiveness would ever come, I knew I had already found something better: freedom. Outside, the city lights shimmered like a second sky. I stood there a long time listening to the faint hum of traffic below, feeling the weight of everything that had brought me here. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, but tonight I let the silence settle around me, calm and certain, knowing this time it was mine to keep. The months after graduation passed in a quiet rhythm. My days began early, filled with morning commutes and long hours at my new job downtown. The office smelled of fresh paint and strong coffee, and every small success, a good presentation, a solved problem, felt like proof that the struggle had been worth it. I rented a small apartment close enough to walk to work and filled it slowly, one paycheck at a time. A sturdy dining table, curtains that caught the afternoon light, a single framed photograph of my grandparents on the mantel. For the first time, my life was built on my own choices. But peace is never as simple as a closed door. My parents hadn't reached out since the repayment notice from the bank. Their silence felt heavier than anger. My grandmother called sometimes, her voice gentle but careful, as if she was trying to stitch two sides of a torn cloth without pulling the thread too tight. "They're embarrassed, Clara," she said once, "but maybe that's what it takes to see themselves clearly." I never asked her to explain. In early summer, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single note, my father's handwriting unmistakable. "We lost the house. Your mother's staying with her sister. I hope you're satisfied." The paper trembled in my hands. There were no apologies, no acknowledgement, only blame dressed in sorrow. I folded it once and placed it in a drawer next to my old student ID and the bracelet my grandfather had given me. Some losses don't need revisiting. Work became my anchor. The company was a small startup specializing in environmental design, modest, but full of people who believed in progress. My supervisor, Elaine Porter, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a kind heart, took me under her wing. "You've got the right instinct," she said one afternoon, reviewing my project sketches. "You don't just design, you listen to what a space needs." Those words stayed with me longer than she knew. In late August, my grandfather invited me to lunch at his country club, a place I hadn't been since I was a child. The building overlooked a stretch of rolling green hills, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and rain. He looked healthier than before, a light back in his eyes. "You're settling in?" he asked as we sat down. "I am," I said. "Work's good. I'm learning a lot." He smiled, the kind that softened the lines on his face. "You remind me of your grandmother when she started her first business. All grit, no complaint." Then his expression turned thoughtful. "Clara, I've been reviewing some of the family holdings. There's an investment branch that needs restructuring. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I'd like you to oversee it part-time for now." The offer caught me off guard. "You trust me with that?" I asked. He nodded. Trust has to start somewhere. The position wasn't about money. It was about belonging, about stepping into a part of the family legacy that had always felt out of reach. I accepted. The next few months passed in a blur of balance sheets, late-night emails, and quiet dinners with my grandparents. I learned that power used well didn't have to look loud. It could be steady, like a hand holding a compass. In early winter, my grandmother fell ill with pneumonia. I drove to the hospital after work, the halls smelling of antiseptic and peppermint gum from the nurse's break room. She looked small under the white sheets, but her smile was as familiar as ever. "Don't look so worried," she said, voice weak but teasing. "I'm not going anywhere just yet." My grandfather sat beside her, his fingers laced with hers. For a moment, the years between us disappeared. We were just three people who had weathered storms in different ways. "You two keep each other honest," she said. "That's what family should mean." She recovered slowly, and by Christmas, the house was filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine again. It wasn't the grand celebration it used to be. No cousins, no uncles, no polished performances of unity. Just the three of us and a simple dinner by the fireplace. After dessert, my grandfather handed me a folder. Inside was a letter of intent and new legal documents for the trust he'd mentioned months ago. My name stood alone on every page. I wanted to be sure he said, watching me read. "This time there's no room for misunderstanding. You earned this, Clara." I looked up, emotion catching in my throat. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll do something good with it," he replied. "That's enough." When I left that night, snow had just begun to fall, thin flakes catching the porch light. My grandparents stood in the doorway waving as I backed down the drive. I didn't know it then, but it would be the last Christmas we'd all spend together. 2 months later, my grandfather suffered a mild stroke. It wasn't fatal, but it changed him. His voice grew softer. His energy faded, and he started speaking more about the past, his early struggles, his regrets, his hopes for what would come after. "Money builds walls if you let it," he said one afternoon as I sat with him by the window. "But integrity that builds bridges. Promise me you'll remember that." I nodded, unable to find the right words. By spring, his health had stabilized, though the sparkle in his eyes never fully returned. I visited every Sunday, bringing him his favorite lemon pie and updates on the investment work. Sometimes we just sat in silence, the sound of the clock marking time. Neither of us could slow down. Then one morning in May, I opened my email to find a message from a lawyer I didn't recognize. It was addressed to me and CC'd to my parents. The subject line read, "Notice of Revised Estate Distributions." My hands tightened on the mouse as I clicked it open. The message was brief, a formal announcement that my grandfather's estate, including properties, businesses, and liquid assets, had been restructured under my name as primary beneficiary. My parents were listed as secondary with limited access. I sat there for a long time staring at the screen. It wasn't just inheritance. It was trust made tangible, a decision that rewrote the family hierarchy in quiet ink. The phone rang later that evening. My mother's number flashed across the screen. I hesitated before answering. Her voice trembled on the other end. "So, it's true," she said. "He's giving it all to you." I closed my eyes. "It's not about taking anything from you. It's about what you gave up." She didn't reply. I could hear her breathing faint and uneven. "We were desperate, Clara. We thought we were doing what was best." "I know," I said, "but what you thought was best nearly broke me." A soft sob caught in her throat before the line went dead. I didn't call back. Some conversations can't be finished in one lifetime. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, the bracelet on my wrist catching the light from the window. The compass charm rested against my skin, pointing somewhere unseen but certain. I thought about the road behind me, the long nights, the letters, the silence, and realized that forgiveness didn't have to mean return. Sometimes it simply meant letting go of the weight you didn't need to carry anymore. Outside, the first summer storm rolled in thunder, low and distant. I stood by the window and watched the rain hit the glass, each drop sliding down in thin, trembling lines. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing for what might come next. I was ready for it. The summer heat lingered longer than usual that year. By early July, the air around the Whitaker estate shimmered in the afternoon sun, heavy with the sound of cicadas. My grandfather had recovered enough to walk the gardens again, though he leaned on a cane, now each step measured and deliberate. I visited every weekend, helping my grandmother tend the hydrangeas that curved along the back fence. We didn't speak much about the past anymore. Words had been replaced by quiet gestures, tea left steeping a little longer, an extra chair pulled out for me at breakfast. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. My new role, managing part of the family's investments, brought me closer to the world I'd once only glimpsed from the edges. I learned quickly, spending long nights reviewing reports, tracing old transactions, and discovering how many decisions had been made by people who never expected to be questioned. Some accounts were solid, transparent. Others were not. One folder in particular caught my attention late one evening in the study. It contained documents from an older investment one listed under my father's name, dated from the same years he'd been draining my college fund. The numbers didn't add up. Transfers moved from joint family holdings into a private account, then vanished. At first I told myself I was reading it wrong, but as I followed the trail page by page, the truth became clear. My parents hadn't just used my trust. They had been quietly pulling from my grandfather's accounts as well. The next morning I brought the folder to my grandfather's attention. He read in silence, his hand tightening around the cane beside him. "I suspected," he said finally. "After your grandmother's surgery, the balances didn't match, but I wanted to believe it was oversight." He closed the folder slowly. I didn't want to believe my own son would do it again. The decision that followed came quietly, like most of his choices, swift, clean, irreversible. He called his attorney, Michael Larson, and by the end of the week the documents for a full audit were filed. My parents would receive official notice within days. When the call came that Sunday night, I was at home folding laundry by the window. My mother's voice came through first sharp and trembling. "How could you do this?" she demanded. "He's sick, Clara. You're going to kill him with this stress." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, keeping my voice steady. I didn't take anything. I found what was already missing. "You could have come to us," she said. "We could have fixed it privately." "You've said that before," I replied, "and look where it led." There was a long silence on the other end, then a soft, broken whisper. "You don't understand. Your father just wanted to keep the family afloat." I closed my eyes. At everyone else's expense. When the line went dead, the room felt smaller somehow, the air thick with all the words that would never be said. I stood there a long time before turning out the light. The following week, I returned to the estate for a meeting with my grandfather, the attorney, and the auditors. They set up in the formal dining room, now stripped of its old warmth, replaced by open files and quiet murmurs. My grandmother hovered near the doorway, her worry written in every small movement. When my parents arrived, the air changed. My father's face was pale, his suit too tight at the collar. My mother looked hollow, her eyes rimmed red. My grandfather remained seated at the head of the table. "Sit down," he said, voice steady but cold. "Let's not waste time." The auditors began to review the findings, explaining how the unauthorized transfers had been hidden under miscellaneous expenses, all routed through temporary accounts that vanished after use. The sum wasn't catastrophic, but it was deliberate. When they finished, the silence was heavier than before. My father's jaw worked as he stared at the papers. "I can explain?" he started. My grandfather leaned forward, his cane resting against the table. "You explained last time. I won't hear it again." His voice didn't rise, but the disappointment in it cut deeper than anger ever could. "You were trusted. Twice. And both times you chose yourself." My mother's eyes filled, and she reached for his arm. "We thought we could pay it back. We just needed time." "You've had years," my grandfather said. "You chose to hide instead." He turned to me, then his expression softening. "Clara, from this day forward, all family accounts are under your supervision. I've signed over full authority." The words hung in the air like a closing door. My father's face went still. "You can't do that," he said quietly. "I already have," my grandfather replied. "And when I'm gone, she'll take over completely." For a long moment no one spoke. Then my father stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "You're destroying this family," he said, his voice shaking. "No," my grandfather said, his eyes never leaving him. "You did that when you stopped being honest." They left soon after, my mother trailing behind her shoulders, bent as if she were carrying the weight of the whole house. When the door closed, the sound echoed through the hall. After they were gone, my grandfather leaned back, his breath unsteady. "I didn't want this ending," he said softly. But it was coming either way. I placed my hand over his. "You did what was right." He nodded, though his eyes stayed on the window where the late sun stretched long shadows across the floor. In the weeks that followed, I focused on stabilizing the accounts, making sure everything was transparent and secure. The work grounded me. It gave purpose to pain that had once felt aimless. My father's silence remained, but my mother sent one short letter near the end of August. "We've moved to a small place near Asheville. Your father isn't well. He asks for nothing, only that you take care of your grandfather." The handwriting wavered, the ink blotted near the signature. I folded it neatly and placed it in the same drawer as her first note. By autumn, my grandfather's health began to fade again. He grew quieter, his sentences shorter, but his eyes stayed clear. We spent most afternoons on the porch, the air smelling of fallen leaves and distant rain. Sometimes he would tell stories about his early years, how he built the first factory, how he met my grandmother at a church picnic and borrowed a car just to drive her home. Other days we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd both survived, needing no words. One afternoon, as the sun sank low, he turned to me and said, "You've carried this family further than I ever did." I shook my head, but he smiled faintly. "It's true, you gave it back its backbone." The following week his condition worsened. I stayed at the house, sleeping in the guest room down the hall. The doctors came and went, their voices quiet, their eyes kind but final. My grandmother rarely left his side, her hand always resting on his arm. Late one night, I woke to the sound of her calling my name. I rushed into the room, and there he was, his breathing shallow but calm, his gaze steady on us both. He reached for my hand, his fingers cool and thin. "Keep it honest, Clara," he whispered, "and keep it kind." Then his eyes closed, and the stillness that followed felt like the air itself had paused. The funeral was small, just family and a few longtime friends. My parents came standing apart near the back, their faces unreadable. I didn't speak to them, but when the service ended, my mother stepped forward, touching my arm briefly before walking away. My father didn't say a word. That night, I sat in my grandfather's study, surrounded by his books and the faint smell of cedar. On the desk lay the compass bracelet he'd given me, the charm catching the lamplight. I slipped it back on and opened the window. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves he'd planted decades ago. In that quiet, I realized the turning point wasn't just about inheritance or justice. It was about the moment a legacy stopped being about wealth and started being about truth, the kind that couldn't be stolen, rewritten, or silenced. I stayed there until dawn, the first light spilling across the desk, knowing the next chapter was waiting and that this time I would lead it. After the funeral, the house felt like a museum of quiet things. My grandmother kept fresh flowers in the foyer, as if color could trick time into softening what it had taken. I spent the next several weeks sorting through papers in my grandfather's study, financial records, handwritten notes, the kind of order only he could maintain. Each drawer carried pieces of his life's work. Letters from colleagues, blueprints of early ventures, and small reminders that nothing he built came easily. One afternoon, as I cataloged the last stack of documents, Michael Larson, the family attorney, arrived. He greeted my grandmother first, then turned to me. "Your grandfather finalized a number of changes before his passing," he said gently. "He wanted you to understand everything directly." We sat at the long dining table, now cleared of its usual polish and shine. Michael unfolded several folders, sliding one toward me. "This is the executed trust," he explained. "It includes all family assets, the holdings, properties, and shares. You are now the sole trustee." The words barely settled before my grandmother reached for my hand. "He meant for it to be this way," she said softly. "He wanted to be sure you could protect what he couldn't anymore." Michael continued outlining the details, the stipulations for transparency, the scholarship foundation that my grandfather had requested be established under my name, and the investment clauses tied to community development. Each point read like a map, one that led not to wealth, but to purpose. When he finished, he added quietly, "He trusted you, Clara. He said you'd know what to do." I signed where he indicated, the pen steady in my hand. Outside, the sky had turned overcast, clouds gathering along the horizon. My grandmother excused herself to make tea, leaving Michael and me alone in the fading light. "There's one more thing," he said. From his briefcase, he produced a sealed envelope with my name written across it in my grandfather's handwriting. I waited until after he left to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged. "You've restored what was broken, Clara. Don't spend your life fighting shadows. Build something brighter in their place." That night, I sat at the study desk, the letter beside me, the bracelet glinting faintly under the lamp. The words stayed with me, shaping the weeks that followed. The months after the estate transfer were quiet, but full. My work at the investment branch expanded naturally into leadership. Elaine Porter, my supervisor, became an advisor in the new foundation I established, the Whitaker Initiative, a program supporting first-generation college students. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Each decision felt like a small act of repair, one that turned history into something useful again. Still, there were moments when the weight of it pressed down. Late at night, I'd walk through the garden where my grandfather used to sit, the hydrangeas fading into winter gray. The silence there wasn't empty, it was listening. In December, a letter arrived from Asheville, postmarked but unsigned. The handwriting was familiar, shaky, but unmistakable. "Your father's been ill. He's asking to see you. Please decide for yourself." There was no return address, only the town and a rural route number. I stared at the letter for a long time. The choice sat heavy on the table for days as I moved through work and obligations. My grandmother noticed my distraction but didn't pry. One evening as we cleared the dinner plates, she said quietly, "Some doors you close by walking away, others you close by opening them one last time." The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove south. The road wound through mountains washed in pale winter light, the trees bare and skeletal against the sky. I found the address on a quiet street lined with aging pines, a modest one-story house with peeling white paint. A car I didn't recognize sat in the driveway. When I knocked, my mother opened the door. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes tired but not unkind. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she stepped aside. "He's in the back room," she said. My father lay propped against a pillow, a blanket pulled to his chest. The illness had thinned him, carved the sharpness out of his features. When he saw me, his breath caught. "Clara," he said quietly, voice rough. "You came." I stood by the doorway, unsure how to start. "I got your letter," I said. He nodded weakly. "I didn't think you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. He closed his eyes for a moment, then looked toward the window where pale light filtered through lace curtains. "I heard about the foundation," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud." There was no bitterness in his voice, only something softer, fatigue, maybe regret. I pulled a chair closer and sat. For a while we said nothing. The only sound was the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, he spoke again. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just needed you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. For thinking strength meant taking instead of trusting." His words were uneven, interrupted by shallow breaths. I listened, not ready to answer. He reached for the nightstand and pulled out a small velvet box. "Your grandfather gave this to me years ago," he said. "I was supposed to pass it to you on your 21st birthday. He handed it to me. Inside was a delicate silver watch, the back engraved with a single line, 'Time tells the truth.'" I ran my thumb over the inscription, unsure what to say. "I can't change what I did," he said softly. "But I hope you never lose track of time the way I did, thinking there was always more to make it right." When I looked up, his eyes were glassy but clear. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for telling me." I stayed a few hours talking in fragments about work, about my grandmother, about the house he hadn't seen in years. When I stood to leave, he didn't ask me to stay. He just nodded once as if understanding was enough. My mother walked me to the door, her expression unreadable. "He won't last long," she said. "But I think seeing you gave him peace." Outside, the sky had begun to darken. I sat in the car for a while before starting the engine, the watch still in my hand. The drive back was silent except for the hum of tires on pavement and the rhythmic tick of the dashboard clock. Somewhere between the miles, the anger I'd carried for so long began to loosen. Not gone, but lighter, like something that had finally been acknowledged. When I returned home, the first thing I did was wind the silver watch and set it beside my grandfather's compass bracelet on the desk. 2 keepsakes, 2 men, and all the lessons they left behind. That night, I stood at the window overlooking the city lights. The reflection in the glass was faint, but steady. For years, I'd believed justice meant undoing the harm, restoring balance where trust had been broken. But now, as I watched the lights blur into a quiet horizon, I realized justice also lived in the choice to end what began in hurt, to stand in truth without carrying its shadow. The next morning, I received a call from Michael Larson. My father had passed peacefully in his sleep. I thanked him, though there wasn't much else to say. When I hung up, I sat by the window and let the light fill the room. The ticking of the watch beside me was soft, unhurried, a sound that felt almost like forgiveness. A few days later, I returned to the estate. My grandmother met me in the doorway, her eyes kind but knowing. "It's over now, isn't it?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "in its own way." She nodded and reached for my hand. "Then let's make something of the time we still have." Together we stepped into the garden, the first buds of spring beginning to show through the soil. The air smelled of earth and rain, full of small beginnings. For the first time in years, I felt the season changing, not just around me, but within me. And somewhere deep down, I knew the story that started with loss was finally finding its way toward grace. Spring deepened slowly that year, the kind that seemed to breathe new life into everything it touched. The Whitaker gardens came alive again, pale green leaves, soft rain on stone, and the faint scent of lilac drifting through open windows. I spent most mornings there with my grandmother, helping her trim the hydrangeas that had once framed so many quiet moments. Some days we talked about my grandfather, about the way he believed every season carried a lesson if you were patient enough to listen. Other days we worked in silence, content just to be together in the place that had begun to feel whole again. The foundation took shape faster than I expected. Elaine Porter agreed to serve as co-director, and within months we had our first group of scholarship recipients, students who reminded me of myself not long ago, kids with patched shoes and quiet determination. I met each one personally, shaking their hands and listening to their stories. Every letter of acceptance felt like a small restoration of something that had once been stolen, not just from me, but from anyone who had ever been told they had to fight alone. By summer, I began visiting the local community college where the program was based. The walls were covered with photographs of smiling faces, thank you notes pinned in rows. A few students stopped me in the hallway once they learned who I was. They didn't talk about the money. They talked about what it felt like to be believed in. Those moments stayed with me the same way my grandfather's words did his reminder that integrity builds bridges where pride builds walls. Back at the estate, I continued to manage the family accounts, though it no longer felt like a burden. Everything had been reorganized, transparent, and clean. My parents' names no longer appeared on any ledgers, and the legal matters surrounding my father's final affairs had closed quietly. My mother sent a single letter in late June. She wrote that she had found part-time work at a library near Asheville and that she was trying to make peace with the past. Her final line was simple: "I hope we can find our way back to speaking one day." I didn't know what to write in response, so I did not yet. Some bridges take longer to rebuild than others. The days at home grew softer after that. My grandmother smiled more, though the years still showed in her careful movements. In the evenings, we would sit by the window with tea and watch the sunset fall across the pond. The light always turned gold right before it disappeared, and she'd say, "He used to call that the forgiving hour." I understood what she meant now. Forgiveness wasn't forgetting or excusing, it was choosing to keep living without letting bitterness take the lead. One night I found myself back in the study. The desk still held my grandfather's old fountain pen, a stack of letters he'd written to partners long gone, and the compass bracelet he'd given me. Beside it sat my father's silver watch, its ticking faint but steady. I wound it carefully, listening to the rhythm. The two keepsakes didn't feel like reminders of loss anymore. They felt like guidance, one pointing forward, the other reminding me that every moment counts. As the years turned, I learned to measure success differently. It wasn't about the number of grants awarded or the size of the investments I managed. It was about the quiet mornings when I walked into my office and saw the framed photograph on my desk, my grandparents in the garden, smiling in a way that said they had done their best. It was about the students who called to say they'd finished their degrees, the letters that arrived with shaky handwriting and hope tucked between the lines. Sometimes when I lock up the office late at night, I pause by the front door and look at the nameplate, the Whitaker Initiative, founded in memory of Howard and Evelyn Whitaker, dedicated to the pursuit of honest beginnings. It feels right knowing the story didn't end with the will or the losses or even the reckoning. It ended with renewal, with a name once clouded by betrayal, now standing for something good. The past hasn't disappeared. It still lives in the corners of my mind, the Thanksgiving dinner where truth unraveled the long nights of paperwork and confrontation, the ache of words that can't be taken back. But when those memories surface, they don't sting like they used to. They remind me that even broken beginnings can lead somewhere worthwhile if you don't stop walking. One evening as I left the estate, my grandmother stood at the door. "You've made him proud," she said quietly. The porch light caught the silver in her hair, and for a second she looked just as she had the night I first learned the truth, steady, graceful, unflinching. I hugged her, feeling the years between us and the love that had carried both of us through. Driving home that night, I rolled down the windows and let the warm air rush in. The stars stretched wide above the highway, and I thought about how much had changed, not just around me, but inside me. I had spent years chasing fairness, believing justice was a finish line you crossed. But standing there at the end of everything, I understood something simpler. Real justice isn't about repayment. It's about restoration, the kind that begins quietly, one honest choice at a time. And maybe that's what my grandfather wanted me to learn all along. Before I end this story, I'll leave you with this. If you've ever had to rebuild from something unfair, don't lose faith in what's still possible. The truth might hurt, but it can also heal. And when it does, it leaves you stronger, not smaller. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means moving forward with grace.